Thank you, everybody. I understand that the cardinal sin here is to overrun. So I'm going to set the timer on my phone just to warn me for how long I'm going on for. And I've also bought these papers to arrange, which I hope I'm not even going to need, but it makes me feel a bit more secure if they're there. I might use the handheld mic. Is that all right, technical people? Thank you, that's better. Then I can sort of wander around a bit. Could I have my first slide, please? Okay, the story I'm going to tell you, even though I'm a novelist and I normally make things up, this story is true. And this story is a love triangle. The lady that you see up there is my great-great-grandmother, who went by the name of Caroline Lee. Her family name was Spank. Nobody knows why this was so. Some people say it was because she was always very smartly dressed. She was spanking new. Other people say it was her habit of walloping her son when he got out of hand. But anyway, that's Spank. Her proper name was Caroline Lee. The family knew her as Spank. And she was, according to our family history, a pure-blood Romany, a gypsy, an English Romanichal gypsy. She was born in the 1850s, that much we know. Nobody knows precisely when or where she was born, and the family story, I was told, was that she was born in somewhere like Eastern Europe, and that she came to this country on a ship with a big white sail. I've actually got reason to believe that that probably wasn't true. It's more likely she was born somewhere like Spalding. We're a great one for storytellers in our family, but as you may or may not know, in the 19th century, from 1837 onwards, everybody was supposed to register births, deaths, or marriages. Romanies very rarely did this. It wasn't in their interest to let the authorities know who or where they were, and if they did register a birth, they were more likely to do it with whatever name happened to occur to them as a good name to use on that particular day. They did sometimes get christened. You can find them in the parish records. This was advantageous. A lot of Romanies were very religious anyway, but it was also advantageous if you had 8 or 9 children. You went to the local vicar, you said, "Vicar, I've found God," and he's very pleased because there's 8 or 9 of the little mites, and they say, "I found God, Vicar. I'd like to get all my children christened at once." And then the villagers would bring presents because this vast family had found God. Give it a couple of weeks, you could then move to a neighbouring parish and go to the church and say, "Vicar, I've found God," and get another 8 or 9 presents for your children. Anyway, Caroline Lee, although she was born sometime in the 1850s, we only know roughly, but we know when she died, which was 1949, and she lived well into her 90s, which is how come we have this picture of her. So my father, who was in his 20s when she died, he can remember her very clearly, and he was absolutely terrified of her. She was very, very tiny and very fierce and had very, very dark, piercing eyes. And apparently she always dressed very, very smartly in smart coats with a slightly mangy fox fur draped around her shoulders and a hat with a big ostrich feather and little lace-up boots. And if you knew what was good for you, you didn't get on the wrong side of Spank. Anyway, she did get something wrong herself in her early years. When she was in her mid-teens, she fell pregnant. Nobody knows who the culprit was, and that's information I've not been able to trace, unfortunately. She gave birth to her son, an illegitimate boy, in a graveyard in a village outside Peterborough called Werrington. The story is the local vicar took pity on them and gave them a sort of shack in the graveyard. Nobody knows whether her son was actually born in that shack or on a grave itself. But it's in the parish records, Gypsy boy, born in the graveyard. That was my great-great-grandfather. So can we have the next slide, please? This is my great-great-grandfather, George Smith, or as he was known in our family, Tabletop. Now, I don't know why he was called Tabletop. I have been told that it was on account of his flat head. But if you look at that, his head doesn't look particularly flat. I think there's various explanations for that story. That's Tabletop in his army uniform later in life. When he was a boy, he was, by all accounts, a bit of a terror. Later in life, when my father knew him, he was almost completely bald. But his mother had raised him to be a smart boy. The only hair he had left when he got older, tabletop, was a long strand of hair that came out of the back. He was completely bald on top and bald around the sides, but he had this long strand of hair that came out of the back. And apparently he would oil it, and he would then wrap it round his head, fashion it into a kiss curl on his forehead, and pull his cap on top. So that was tabletop, an extremely vain man, as you can see. Anyway, he did what a lot of Romanies did in the 19th century. His mother, Spank, she married a man called Lee. That's how she became Caroline Lee. And the family travelled from one harvest to another. It was a very common pattern. You would go sort of hop picking one season, potato picking another season, travelling from harvest to earn a living. And it was while he was working as a fruit picker on a Cambridgeshire estate that my great-grandfather, tabletop, met his future wife, Hepzibah Lavinia Odell. And can we have the next slide, please? This is Hepzibah. Now, that looks as though she's wearing an extremely grand hat. It is, in fact, a tear in the photograph, I'm sorry to say. She's a tall woman, Hepzibah. She's almost the diametric opposite to Spank. And she's got the mangy fox fur, though, as you can see, and a big dark-brimmed hat. Hepzibah, I was told by my family, was a high-born lady. She was the landowner's daughter, and she came round collecting the rent from the gypsy caravans, or vardos as they were called. Anyway, Tabletop and Hepzibah took one look at each other and fell madly in love. Apparently, when her father found she was consorting with gypsies, he horsewhipped her and locked her in her room. However, such was Hepzibah's love for Tabletop that she escaped from her room, shinnied down a drain pipe, and she and Tabletop eloped across the fens. Now, apparently, when her father found out, he was completely furious, and he and her brothers set off across the fens on horseback to get them. And you can imagine if they'd actually caught up with them, then it wouldn't have looked very good for Tabletop. Anyway, they couldn't find them. Tabletop and Hepzibah went to East Cambridge, where her family originated from, and they got married in a church in East Cambridge. She wanted her family to know that she wasn't a completely fallen woman. She wanted them to know she was going to be legally wed, so she sent a notice to them of when the wedding would be and invited them to come, but none of them turned up, and none of them ever spoke to her again because she'd disgraced the family by running off with a gypsy. However, without telling her, her father paid for the church bells to be rung as she came out of the church. Which would have been very sweet, apart from the fact that apparently she said quite often, according to my Auntie Betty, it would have been better if one of the bells had fallen off and killed me stone dead. Such a life she had with Tabletop. Tabletop, as it turned out, was a general ne'er-do-well. He and Hepzibah were incredibly poor. They constantly had the debtors chasing after them. At one point, they didn't even have enough money for a vardo. They were sleeping in ditches by the side of the road. And there's all sorts of family stories about how they survived. Apparently, one night, they were desperate for somewhere to sleep, so they took shelter in a derelict cottage that was rumoured to be haunted, and none of the locals would go near it. And in the middle of the night, the ghosts came and ripped the blankets off their backs and whirled them around the room, and Tabletop and Hepzibah were forced to flee down the road. Anyway, it was a tough life. Hepzibah was cast out by her own family, but she was never accepted by the Romanese either, because she was what's known as a gorger, which is a pejorative term for a non-Romany, and her children, when she eventually had them, were half and halves, which is also not a nice thing to say about anyone in Romany culture. She had particular problems with her mother-in-law, with Spank. Apparently, the first time they met, Spank said to Hepzibah, "You've married my son, and you'll sop sorrow by the spoonful till the day you die." I think we can safely say that's not a good start to in-law relationships. The two of them didn't get on at all. They were at loggerheads for 30 years, although they were often forced to live together in close quarters throughout those 30 years. Having said that, it can't be all bad, have been all bad, because Hepzibah and Tabletop did manage to have 5 children, one of them my father's mother. But you can just see how difficult it was for these 2 women to get on, and you can see why it was a love triangle, because Tabletop, the man at the centre of this triangle, he was everything to both of them. He was the only child that Spank ever had, and she had disgraced herself in order to have him. And Hepzibah had given up her whole family to be with this man. By all accounts, he was completely unworthy of their love, and by all accounts, he was almost a sort of empty vessel into which they poured all their love and antagonism. It was a very strange story, but they did stay together. They had their 5 children. And later, Tabletop served in the First World War. He was actually too old to serve in the First World War. He was born in the 1970s, so he lied about his age to get in, to make himself younger. 2 of his sons lied about their age to make themselves older. So the 3 of them went off to the First World War together. The story is that my great-uncle Cornelius, one of Tabletop's sons, before he was sent out to the Western Front, he was on parade one day. And, you know, generally, Romany people, they don't take kindly to having their appearance criticised. They're very, very proud people. Apparently, the Prince of Wales was inspecting this parade, and as he came along the line of soldiers, he stopped, and he took his cane and tapped Great-Uncle Cornelius's brass button, one of the brass buttons on his uniform, which apparently had a smear of dirt on it. Anyway, Great-Uncle Cornelius responded in characteristic manner by punching him on the nose. After which he was beaten soundly and then sent straight out to the Western Front, where, according to my Auntie Betty, he had his private shot off. Anyway, he came back with severe shell shock, as well he would. So in many senses, he only came back partially from the war, but they did at least all come back alive, which was quite extraordinary. For a while after the First World War, Tabletop and Hepzibah tried to live together, but it never really worked out. And Tabletop went to live with his mother, with Spank, in a cottage just outside Ely, in a village called Sutton. My father can remember visiting them there. He was very proud, my father, because he was the only grandchild that Tabletop would give a penny to, because he was the first grandson, which gave him great status in Tabletop's eye. And Tabletop would hand over this penny and say, "Here you are, Ken, buy yourself some carrots." And the other thing that he used to do is he would take my dad out to the surrounding fields, and he would hunt through the birds' nests until they found an egg, usually a blackbird's egg. And then he would take my father back into the cottage, and he would find the smallest frying pan, and he would fry this tiny egg, and then he would cut a tiny piece of toast, and he would put the tiny egg on the tiny piece of toast and serve it to my father, who was very small at that time, as you can imagine. So anyway, that's what happened to them, and I think if we could maybe do the next slide very quickly. This is me researching my family history, tracking down all the kind of the birth, death and marriage certificates, the ones that I could find. I found out that a lot of the families weren't quite true. Hepzibah wasn't a highborn lady at all. In fact, she was the illegitimate daughter of an illiterate laundry maid called Emma Halfpenny. How she ended up having the name Odell and living in the Fens was something I had to invent when I based my fifth novel on this story. Anyway, what I'd like to do now, I would like to play you a little sideshow and a small piece of music. My father wouldn't like me being up here, I may as well say. He says, "You want to stop talking about our Gypsy family. If you're not careful, you'll get a brick through your window." And the following slides might give you some idea why. If we could have an excerpt of music and the little slideshow that we've got, please. Thank you.
Maladile
During the Second World War, between 250,000 and 500,000 Romanis were murdered by the Nazis. Many Roma historians believe that figure is a massive underestimate, and they estimate it at near a million. Whatever the exact figures were, they were killed in roughly the same proportion as the Jewish populations in the occupied territories, around 85%. The song you heard there was Gelem Gelem, which is the Romani national anthem. And as some of you probably spotted, the last few slides that you saw there were not from the Second World War, they were from modern-day Europe. If we can just go back to the first coloured slide. These two bodies are on a beach in Italy a couple of years ago. They're two Romany girls who were selling trinkets on the beach, went into the water, playing around, got into difficulties, nobody helped them, and they drowned. When their bodies were pulled from the water, they were laid on the beach. As you can see, towels were put over them, and the holiday makers carried on picnicking and sunbathing nearby. And here are the next slide is of their coffins being taken away while people are sunbathing. The following slide is the girls with their family. They were 14 and 15 years old. The remaining few slides are very recent, and you can show them. This is France in 2010, courtesy of Mr. Sarkozy, who is currently deporting Romani people based, as leaked memorandums have revealed, on the basis of their ethnicity. This is collective punishment. These people have committed no crime. Somebody in their camp might be suspected of a crime, and the gendarmes have gone in, and the whole families have been shipped back to Romania. There are 10 million Roma across Europe. 86% live below the official poverty line, and it's the fastest growing ethnic minority in Europe. This is a problem that's not going to go away, however many Roma Sarkozy puts on his buses. If possible, can we just go back to Spank now at the very beginning? Thank you. I'm just going to round up now to say that I don't really know what the truth of my great-great-grandmother's heritage is. I don't know whether she did come to this country in a ship with a big white sail. It's possible, because there was a big migration of Roma here in the 19th century. It may have also been in the 16th century. But I do know that if she hadn't come here, her descendants, including me, almost certainly would have been killed during the Second World War. I'm very proud of the fact that my family ancestors were Romani, but I'm even more proud of the fact that they were economic migrants. And I bet if any of you looked into your family history, you would find that your ancestors were economic migrants too. Economic migrancy is what blends us, unites us, changes us. It's what makes us what we are today. Thank you.